In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to weave in yarn tails using reverse duplicate stitch. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Now, there are a lot of different ways to weave in yarn tails. Each method can be useful depending on the location of the tail, the stitch pattern surrounding the tail, and the thickness of the yarn. Today, I will show you the method I use most often for weaving in yarn tails in stockinette fabric. So let's get started. To understand what reverse duplicate stitch is, it's helpful to understand what regular duplicate stitch is to see how they are related. So duplicate stitch is an embroidery technique used on knitted stitches, also known as Swiss darning. And the idea is that you trace an existing knit stitch with a contrast color in order to apply a small amount of color to the surface of knitted fabric. So here I have done 3 stitches in a row where I've traced over the top of existing stitches using duplicate stitch. Now with duplicate stitch, you can also go up a column of stitches, you can go in diagonal, so you can create an entire little picture or motif of some sort using the contrast color. So it's usually used when only a small area of color is needed. Reverse duplicate stitch uses that idea of following a path of stitches along an existing row by tracing the path, but on the wrong side of the work. And you're doing it to weave in the yarn tails. So I'm working on a sweater right now that has it has 5 different contrast color stripes in it, which means I have to change the yarn pretty frequently. That means I have a starting tail and an ending tail for each one of these stripes every few rows. So what I can do is I can weave the ends of these tails in by weaving them in along the path of a single row of stitches. And that's what I've done here. This yarn tail started out here and I wove it in along the edge of the stripe in the existing stitches. Ending here. I haven't cut the tails yet. What's nice about reverse duplicate stitch is that the fabric still stretches the way it did before, and the tail stretches with it. So you don't end up cutting the tail and having the fabric stretch and then having the tail pop out. So you can actually trim these tails pretty close to the surface of the fabric and not worry about the tails popping through to the front. When you look at a piece of knitting like this, you can see this is where I've changed. I've got 2 yarn tails hanging, so there's a little hole. I have to take care of the hole and I have to weave these 2 tails in. But it's not always obvious when you look at this fabric, how am I going to trace the path of a row of stitches in order to weave in these yarn tails. The method that I have found easiest for learning this process is to knit a swatch in a light colored, smooth yarn and use a needle a couple of sizes larger than you typically use in order to knit the swatch. And then about halfway up, knit a single row of stockinette in a contrast color, then return to working in the light colored yarn for the rest of the swatch. Then when you turn the swatch over, what you see, these purl bumps, these green purl bumps that you see, this is from 1 row of stitches. You can see that the heads of the stitches, that's the top of the stitch, creates 1 set of purl bumps. And then the running threads between stitches, you can see where they're interconnected here, the base, create another set of purl bumps. And then in between these 2 sets of green purl bumps, you see another 2 sets of purl bumps. So you're seeing the running threads of the white row above this green row, right here, and down here you see the heads of the white row of stitches below this green row. So you have this interconnection here. So just for practice, I'm going to use the same white yarn that I used to create the swatch. I'm going to just practice following a row of stitches. So I want to look to see where this green row of stitches is going. So I'm looking at the base purl bump here, and I see that it comes in through here, and on the back, and then when I pull this apart, I can see that the path of that stitch comes up here. So you can see I'm going through a base purl bump here and an upper purl bump there, and they're offset from each other. And now the path of the stitch comes up here. This is where the head of the stitch is. It comes down through this purl bump, and then it comes back through here. So I come to the purl bump that's next to this one where the yarn's coming out, come down through it, and then I'm going back again through that bottom purl bump where I originally had come up before. So I'm coming down through it a second time. And then I'm going to pull just enough so that it covers up that green purl bump, but isn't super tight. I just want to cover it up. Now I look, where is this green bump going? It's going to the purl bump next to it. And then once again, I'm coming up through a bump that I came down through before. So every time, every purl bump you're going to go through twice. You're going to come down through a bump and then up through the bump the next time. And you're always working on this diagonal. So now I want to pull a little bit. So then the next place that I'm going is across this way. So I'm going to go down through the purl bump next to it. And then through the purl bump that I went through before. Pull this up a little bit more. And I tighten it up just enough to take the slack out, but I don't want to tighten it up too much. I don't want to shrink the stitches on the front. I want to just keep following this path. And again, if you can't see where the path is, you can pull the fabric apart to see where that path is. But pretty soon you'll start to get this rhythm of where you're coming through diagonally. Then you always go, you follow the path to the next purl bump over, and then you go up through a purl bump that you came through once before. So when you're practicing, you're covering up that row of green on the back side, and that's how you can tell that you are following the path correctly. You're covering up that green. So here's that original swatch where I had done some regular duplicate stitch. This swatch was knit on a needle that is pretty standard for the yarn weight. This is worsted weight yarn, so I knit it on probably a size 7 needle, something like that, where this other one that I did first, I knit on a size 9 needle, so it was very easy for me to stretch and see what was going on. But once you understand that process of coming diagonally, going across, going back up diagonally, back through where you'd come before, coming back and forth diagonally, once you understand that and you get that process, you can try it in a swatch that's knit at a firmer gauge, or knit at a gauge that's more standard for the yarn weight, because you'll still be able to see the path. It won't be as easy to pull apart, but it'll be a lot easier once you know the rhythm of what you're doing. So here's a swatch where I have switched yarn tails and the 2 tails are hanging there, and you can see that I have a hole. Now the reason I have a hole, these 2 stitches use 2 different balls of yarn. So instead of having a running thread between the 2 stitches that connect one stitch to the other, we've got these tails. So when we want to weave in the ends, what we want to do is cross those tails like this. That creates that missing running thread between the 2. We can weave in ends with this tail going in this direction, and we can weave in this tail along the row going in that direction. So we cross the tails and then we work them in opposite directions. So I want to show you how, without the aid of contrasting colors to guide me, what I would do to weave in these tails. So I'm going to cross these over. So this tail is coming out of this purl bump here, so that's where I'm going to go in the first time. And I always go in diagonally to follow the path. Then I can use this yarn, I can lay it across to see where the head is. I go down through the next purl bump. And again, I'm going down through that purl bump I initially went up the first time. This is coming out of this purl bump, so that I follow the path here. That means I'm coming up through this one, and I want to find on the diagonal the purl bump where I came down through before. Now you don't have to weave in a whole lot. Some people will tell you, some people will say, oh, to do it for a half an inch or an inch. And I find that if the gauge is very large, then that may not be enough stitches. So I tend to find that 4 or 5 stitches is usually plenty, but it kind of depends on how much you have. Like right here, I've done 3 full stitches in this direction, and then I can do 3 stitches in the other direction. So what you're doing when you're doing reverse duplicate stitch, you're essentially creating a second layer of the knitting. So you're creating a thicker bit of fabric right here, but it's following the same path, and the 2 layers are separate from each other. You can see that second layer below this first layer, so it's not typically a great idea to weave in ends of a contrasting color along a row of a color like this. So what would you do instead? In this situation, where I've switched colors, I switched balls because I switched colors, I'm going to have that same issue with a hole, but I want to avoid that problem where you can see the contrast color through the front, just a little bit on the sides. So instead of just crossing them and then working them in the opposite directions, instead I'm going to link the 2 yarns together like this, so that they link together, and then I can work the purple one in reverse duplicate stitch along the purple stitches, and I can work the white tail along the white stitches. Now you could do this regardless of whether the colors were whether they were different colors or not, but you don't have to when they're both the same color. But I would recommend it if they're different colors. Now if you're working with a very bulky yarn, or if you're working at a gauge that's quite firm for the yarn itself, and if the yarn has been plied, you can separate the plies and then weave the plies in, the thinner plies in, separately. So it's more ends to weave in, but you get less bulk. So here I have separated, this is a 3-ply yarn, not a 4-ply, so I have 1 ply and 2 plies. So I can weave in each of these separately and we'll create a less bulky result. So again, here is where I did the full 3 plies, and then over here is where I did the 1 and the 2 plies. So it's less noticeably when you touch it, and it's less visually noticeable as well when you split the plies. But again, you end up having to weave in more ends. The advantage of using reverse duplicate stitch to weave in yarn tails is that the yarn tail will stretch with the fabric. In addition, it's less likely that the trim tail will pop through to the front than with some other methods. Because you're weaving in the tail by following the path of stitches in a horizontal row, it's not an ideal method for weaving in ends within a vertical stitch pattern, such as ribbing. So when is the right time to weave in yarn tails? Well, some knitters weave in all their yarn tails prior to blocking, while others weave in after they've blocked. If you will be blocking the work somewhat aggressively in order to stretch it to a specific size and shape, consider waiting until after blocking before weaving in ends so that you can match the gauge of the blocked project as you weave in yarn tails. Although reverse duplicate stitch is a great technique for weaving in ends, the best way to deal with yarn tails is to avoid having to weave them in at all by using a technique that joins one yarn tail to another as you switch to a new ball. For feltable yarns, the felted join is great, but for other yarns, the Russian join or woven join may be good options for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.